谢谢。
Please tell me you speak English. I'm Detective Carter. Do you speak any English? Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
I love this clip. I think it illustrates the effect that we can have on each other when we are attempting to understand, to listen, to process information. And that's the subject we're looking at today, listening and responding. And this is something that oftentimes we think of in interpersonal relationships, but really is a major part of public speaking. You are probably more often the audience member than you are the speaker. So understanding how the listening process works, what can influence or hinder that process, and what to do when you know that you really better listen well in this situation are really key ideas in the field of public speaking. So today we're going to look at what the listening process is and how to effectively respond and avoid some of the pitfalls that are most common in a public speaking instance. And honestly, some of these things can apply to a interpersonal relationship or small group setting as well. So let's start with what the listening process is. Now, most people think that listening is the same as hearing. And actually, this is probably the main reason why we struggle so much with listening, because of this initial preconceived notion that hearing and listening are the exact same thing. They are not. Listening is so much more involved. It is much more nuanced, so much more multifaceted, that it is not something that can be achieved effectually just by the physiological process of hearing that information. As a matter of fact, hearing is really only the very first step in the entire listening process. So here is a definition of listening that I think illustrates very clearly what listening is when you see the whole picture. So listening is the process of first receiving information. That's the hearing. That's where you get the total definition that most people think of when they think of listening. And unfortunately, that's where we usually stop. Well, if I'm listening to you, I'm hearing what you're saying, and that's it. But really, it's only the first step in the whole process. So we start with receiving. Then we follow that with attending, so picking out what information we're going to pay attention to. Then we follow that with constructing meaning from that information. So we've decided what the information is, now we're going to determine what it means. And then after that, and only after that, do we understand and respond to all of this stimuli. And the stimuli, what we are listening to, is not just what words are coming out of our mouths, but also what we see and what we don't see, what we hear and what we don't hear. So there is so much more to listening than we think, and it is what gets us in trouble when we think that we're effective listeners, and in reality, we are only effective hearers. So let's look at some of those things that factor into the process and what nuances may factor into why we struggle with listening. Let's start with that first step, that receiving. Now first, when we receive information, what we initially think of is what auditory information we hear. But it is not just what we hear. If you're looking at this awesome picture here, I think you can safely agree with me that when we listen, when we attain information, we are attaining more than just words that are coming out of a person's mouth. We get a lot more information than just actual language. So attending to all of this information, be it physical material like something someone's wearing, the tone of their voice as opposed to the actual words, maybe it is silence, maybe it is the posture that they are holding or the gestures that they're using, their eye contact, all of these things are part of what we hear. And when I say hear, put that in quotes. I am hearing both verbal and nonverbal information and receiving both verbal and nonverbal information. And once all that stuff comes at me, I have to intentionally focus in on certain pieces. Sometimes I don't have a choice about what I focus in on. When you see a picture like this, you don't really have a choice in some cases about what you attend to and what you don't. The speaker has decided what they are going to put at the forefront. Now you as a speaker have a little bit of control over this. For example, when you give a presentation on a subject that is very serious or has a lot of academic intonation with it, you can choose to dress in a way that aids in the understanding of your material, that doesn't distract from it. But if that's not your goal, if you are trying to be, say, a comedian, or you're trying to be an entertainer in some way, maybe your physical attire needs to enhance what you're saying rather than keep from distracting from what you're saying. So in cases like this, you obviously want to dress in a way that is engaging visually in order to force folks to attend to that information. And in some cases, people will use attire or their tone of voice or what have you to distract from the actual words they're saying. So instead of using it to enhance the material or to keep from being distracting, they will use these attires, this tone of voice, silence, and so on to distract from their position on a subject. And it is hard. It is difficult to attend to the real information these days. And part of that is because people are intentionally trying to be distracting or intentionally forcing you to attend to information that you don't want to attend to. And another part of it is that there's so much out there. There's so much visually, textually, auditorily, there's so much access to so many things that really zoning in on all of the information is pretty much impossible these days. So you have to choose what to attend to, or you're not going to be able to really attend to any one thing or anything at all. Once you have chosen what to attend to, and oftentimes it's what sticks out to you the most, what is abnormal or what is most relevant to your experiences and so forth. So once you have decided to attend to information, you're going to begin to construct meaning in that information. So for example, if a speech is about education and they bring up a variety of different educational situations, if that same speaker begins to speak about communication in the classroom and interpersonal interaction and formal public speaking, I'm automatically going to attend to that information more so than anything else they speak about. For you, it might be if you are in a class and a professor is lecturing on a topic that you have moderate to mild interest in, and they begin to mention extra credit or quiz questions or something like that, you're automatically going to attend to that information because it relates to you in some way. And once you decide to attend to that information, now you're going to be able to construct meaning from it. So you have to let go of everything else and zone in on certain pieces in which you can construct meaning from. Now, in the example I gave about the speech on education, if they do bring up something about interpersonal communication or formal public speaking, I have prior knowledge of that. So I'm going to automatically be able to attend to that information more clearly and with more ability than I would for other information. So if they started to talk about calculus, although I know a little bit about calculus, it's going to be harder for me to construct meaning from what they're saying because I don't have prior knowledge to associate with what the material is that they are lecturing on. So prior knowledge helps us to construct that meaning, which is why you probably benefit if an instructor tries to create an anecdote or a metaphor or something like that to connect broad or abstract concepts to the students. You probably get it much more clearly because they are attempting to provide prior knowledge and connect it to the course material. In addition to that, emotional connections. So if you have a connection to that topic, you feel that you've had experience with it that is emotionally ingrained in you, well, you're going to automatically be able to construct more in-depth meaning from that, and you'll want to attend to it more as well. Okay? So you have to start with the receiving, with that initial step of gathering the information, and then you choose what to pay attention to, that's the attending, and then you construct the meaning from what you have chosen to pay attention to. Follow that as our final piece of the puzzle with the responding of your information, what you've attended to and what you've constructed meaning from, as a projection or a response to the speaker. Now, the response isn't always an actual verbal response. It could just be the mental response you have in your head. If you're listening to your classmates' speeches and somebody's doing a speech on gun control and you have a prior knowledge of gun control and an emotional connection to the topic of gun control, you may have a comment for the speaker, so you will absolutely want to verbally respond, but you may also just be responding in your head. So responding comes in a variety of forms. In your mind, you might be saying, yeah, I agree with this person, or no, that little bit of information doesn't seem right. I wonder where they got that. These are the responses I'm referring to. They come in a lot of forms. So when you are responding, you have to consider a few things. Number one, are you really remembering the information the way it was intended or the way it was laid out? And I want to test this for you. I want to challenge you to get a piece of paper real quick. Any kind of paper, grab a phone that you can type notes into, or a scrap piece of paper and a pencil. Go do that now. Grab that piece of paper, and I'm going to come back to something here in a second that I think will illustrate to you what you struggle with when it comes to remembering real information that actually exists. But in addition to remembering information and actually gathering information that is factual, we also have to decide what is an effective response. How do I appropriately address my thoughts on this subject? And that's a struggle, because you have to consider not only what your knowledge is here, but what the knowledge is of the person you're speaking to, what material you just heard, and how to address the situation. In a classroom setting, it may be one type of response that's needed, where in an informal conversation back and forth between another person and yourself, there might be a completely different type of response needed. So you have to do a kind of mental audience analysis about what is appropriate for that given circumstance. All right, so those are the things that impact responding. Hopefully you went and grabbed yourself a little piece of paper, scrap piece, or using your phone as a note-taking opportunity. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you to write down a series of words that I say. So I'm going to say these words, and I want you to listen really carefully. Don't write them down as I say them. Just put your pencil down, put your phone down, and wait until I say go, and then write the words down. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask you to consider what words you wrote down. So here are the words. Get yourself ready. Put your pencils down. Put your phone down. Get yourself ready to listen to the words. And then when I say go, go ahead and write them down. So here is the list of words. Bed, rest, wake, tired, dream, awake, night, eat, comfort, sound, slumber, snore. Pause the video and write down as many of those words as you can remember. Go. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance, you've unpaused the video, and you've had a chance to write these down. Take maybe 60 seconds or so, so hopefully you've got as many as you can think of. Now look at your list. What do you have on that list? Let me ask you first, do you have the words bed and snore on your list? If you do, you are like most people. They are oftentimes going to remember the first word in a list and the last word in the list. We call that primacy recency. It's where you remember that which comes first and that which comes most recent. That's key because that is a part of public speaking. While most people think of the intro and the conclusion as last resorts, the final pieces to the puzzle that you can just throw in there, they're really not. The intro and conclusion can be a major part of the speech because, like we said, people remember that which comes first and that which comes last. Now look at some of the rest of the words you wrote down. Did you write down wake or night or comfort? Those are all middle of the pack words. Maybe you wrote them down, maybe you didn't. Here's another question. Did you write down the word sleep? If you wrote down the word sleep, You wrote down a word I never said. So I never said the word sleep, but most people, at least 50% of folks, if not closer to 80 to 90% of folks, write down the word sleep. Why do you think that is? Well, if you're looking at the list of words like bed, rest, wake, tired, and so on, these are all words that are associated with sleep. So mentally, your brain has decided to connect all of these things to the concept of sleep, and therefore you have added additional material to a discussion that never existed in the first place. You are remembering something that was never said, that was never there. So honestly, if you think about that, these associations that we mentioned earlier, the prior knowledge, the emotional connections, and so on, while they are beneficial to listening, they can also actually harm what we interpret from a message, because we interpret things from our past experiences or from our associations that never actually happened. Like, for example, if you were to know for a fact that you did something to someone that would upset them, in your mind you think, man, if I did that to this person, I would be mad at them. And then you go have a conversation, fully expecting to walk into this conversation with that other person mad at you. If you go into a conversation like that, and you are having this discussion and expecting them to be upset with you, you are going to read every little nonverbal behavior, every tone of voice, every specific word chosen to reflect that frustration and anger. And in all reality, they may not be mad at you at all. It may not be an issue at all, but you have projected this on there because you've associated what you did with how you would have felt in that circumstance. So when you are remembering things and you're responding to people, careful with sensitive subjects. So if you hear a topic in a speech, in a classroom setting, or in a TED Talk, or in any kind of speaking format, in a lecture or what have you, really be aware of any remote emotional response that you have to subjects, because we do tend to group material together with our past experiences or with our prior knowledge or with associations, and forget that that may not be what the person said or how that person feels in the first place. So you have to be kind of careful. You see how complicated the listening process is? It's not just receiving. There are so many more factors in the process. It really is nuanced. It's so multifaceted. You have to really be conscious of all the pieces when you're having a conversation, because it can make a great deal of difference in the end result that you achieve from material you're gaining in a lecture or a conversation back and forth between you and a friend. So let's look at some of the struggles that we have. And I want to start this by doing a little riddle. Again, I'm going to ask you to grab a pen or a pencil and take a little note on a piece of scrap paper. I'm going to give you 2 riddles, and I want to see what your responses are to those riddles. So just write your answer down as quickly as you can when I ask this question, and let me know if you have any questions about how this riddle went later on. But I'm just going to give you these quick riddles, and I want you to write down your response as fast as you can, and then I'll move to the next one, and we'll see what you got. So here is my first riddle for you. Listen to it carefully. I'm only going to say it once, and then I want you to write your response down. Number 1. Jimmy's mother had 4 sons that she loved very much. She treasured her boys as if they were made of riches. 3 of the sons' names were quarter, nickel, and dime. What was the other son's name? Number 2. You're driving a bus. You go east 12 miles and turn south and go 2 miles, where you take on 9 passengers. Then you turn west and go 3 miles and let off 4 passengers. How old is the bus driver? All right, so you should have responses to each of those. Let's look at what you put. First question, quarter, nickel, dime, and? Did you put penny? Most people put penny. But listen to the question. Jimmy's mother had 4 sons. Jimmy is the 4th son. If you had listened real carefully to what I was saying, you would have caught that right at the beginning. The next one, how old is the bus driver? Many of you probably looked up like, what? What do you mean, how old is a bus driver? What does that have to do with the statement here, this question here? But really, if you listen carefully, you are driving a bus. You go east 12 miles. So how old are you? However old you are is how old the bus driver is. So like I said earlier, listening is so nuanced. Even when someone tells you, listen carefully, pay attention to every detail, and then literally write a response to one question, we still miss it. We still miss those bits and pieces. It's such a multifaceted thing. So what interferes with that? Apart from maybe those connections that we make, are there other things that factor into how effective our listening skills are? Well, certainly there are other things. Why don't we listen better? Because there are all kinds of things that are out to get our listening skills. For first thing on the list is message overload. It means the amount of speech that we encounter can sometimes make it impossible. Actually, in most situations, it is impossible to listen carefully to every single detail. So you get a load of information, and it can be very difficult to understand, comprehend, and remember all of the pieces of that one message. So message overload, even in an everyday conversation, is a factor. But imagine going to a course where there's a lot of terminology or a lot of content that is not comfort level for you. It's not something you know a lot about. Once you get going in that, it's going to be message overload very fast because the message is so complex. So this is part of it. Message overload can play a factor. Preoccupation can play a factor. How many times have you done this in a course? Where you've got a personal concern, and that concern could be you have an issue at work, a relationship struggle, maybe it's more of a physiological concern, you're feeling sick, or your child is sick, or some kind of personal factor is playing a role in your life at the moment. And that can make it very difficult to pay attention to the details in either a lecture setting or a talk setting, as well as in an interpersonal communication. So preoccupation can play a role here as well. Rapid thought is another one. This is where I tend to struggle, especially if I can connect to a topic. My brain starts to speed on up ahead, and I start to think about other things connected to the topic that the person is originally speaking on. And honestly, we are capable of understanding up to 600 words per minute, and in some cases even more, but about 600 words a minute. But the average person speaks only 100 to 150 words per minute. So we speak 450 to 500 words faster, or excuse me, we think 500 words faster than how we speak. So our brain is able to jump ahead without even realizing it. So some of these things can play a part here. A couple of other things, effort. It's not easy. As you can see from what we've talked about, listening is very problematic because it is so involved. There's so much to it. So if you're tired, or if you're sick, or if there's some kind of other factor playing a role here, it's not easy to listen in the most effective way. There can be so many things that impact this process for you. So it's very difficult. Also, external noise. I really struggle with this. I'm the kind of person that I need complete quiet if I'm reading a book or trying to study for an exam. If you're like that, you know what I mean. Any outside distractions cause it to be almost impossible for me to focus in on what I'm trying to read or listen to. And even temperature setting can be problematic. If you're really cold or you're really hot, you get distracted from what you're listening to because you're focusing in on those physiological feelings, like being hot or being cold. So external noise, things outside of our mind, things that are more physical, can play a part here. And also faulty assumptions. This one is one that kind of factors into that remembering that we just talked about. We tend to believe that we're listening attentively, but we're really not. All we're doing is hearing words. We're not paying attention to the nonverbals. We're not understanding that we're only attending to certain things. We're not even constructing meaning appropriately. Maybe we have prejudice or bias or preconceived notions. So we think we're doing it right. But in all actuality, we're only maybe doing half of the first step right. We're hearing words, and that's it. And when the subject is real familiar to us, you've heard it 100 times, you can tune out pretty easily. You zone out on the topic. You know your mother-in-law or your dad has said the same thing a million times, and so you zone out and you maybe don't even hear what they're saying anymore because you've heard it a million times before. So you have these faulty assumptions, these assumptions that may not be accurate. All of these things factor into our effectiveness when it comes to listening in a formal setting and an informal setting. So what do? What happens when you know you have to listen? You've got to get this material in your head, or you really want to make sure that the relationship is strong, and so you know that you have to increase your listening skills. What do? Now, there are 1,000 things that you can do, and honestly, there's no way that we can address them in a heartbeat here. But let's look at some of the common things that you can do. When you are constructing meaning, when you're in that phase, look for some of the key ideas. And if you were in a formal setting, I would actually attempt to outline what the speaker says while they're speaking. So as they're speaking, write down what their thesis statement is or what their main idea is, and then all the reasons why their main idea is supported or how they are agreeing with their main idea. So use that to kind of grab those key ideas. And I say this for things like a lecture or a formal speech from your boss or something like that. Take notes during that point. Write down the main idea, and then underneath that idea, list all of the support for that. So if the argument is, and your boss is giving a presentation that says we have way too much turnover. So the boss says we have way too much turnover. That's the main idea of this speech that he or she is giving. Then underneath that, what are all the reasons that your boss is listing for the turnover? So we have turnover because of the holiday season. We have turnover because of the pay scale. So listing out all of the reasons that support his or her argument that we have a lot of turnover. Again, this is more for a formal thing. What is the person trying to get you to do or think might be something that you do in a more informal setting. So if you're having an argument with someone, a spouse or a friend or a parent, and they are trying to convince you of something, to persuade you of something, think to yourself, what do they want from me? And why do they want it? What are they trying to get me to do or to get me to think? And what are their motivations? Really look for those motivations. That's key. And then once you have the general idea, okay, well, they're trying to get me to loan them some money. And their motivation is that they are really strapped and they just had a huge medical bill they paid for. What are their arguments? How are they trying to get you to motivate them? Here's a key. If you get a lot of emotional appeal over and over again, I thought you were my friend, I really need this or I'm not going to survive, it's all emotional appeal. Be careful there. Usually, not always, but usually if a person has good intentions and a good reason to request something from you, to be persuasive in some way, they will have logical information to back it up. They will have good reasons, and they'll be able to lay them out clearly and support them effectually. Okay? And also, when you get those emotional or biased responses, be prepared to respond. And that's kind of the next thing we're going to look at. What do you say when you do notice that you're getting some of these emotional or biased responses? And honestly, this applies for things that are not emotional or biased. Also, just when you're trying to get key ideas. Look for specific feedback. So when you say, if you're listening to, again, the boss who's talking about turnover, ask them, okay, you said that we have turnover because of the holiday season, and that led me to think that this was temporary. Is that the case? That is a way you would make sure that what you heard was correct and that you evaluated the information appropriately. Because your boss may be able to come back and say, yes, we are having temporary turnover, but it is an ongoing process, not just in the holiday season. So you can verify things. So respond with feedback specification. Make sure that you are getting that information laid out clearly. Also, be Socratic. When you have more informal conversations with a small group or with a one-on-one discussion, ask Socratic questions. And when we say Socratic, Socratic basically means that you continually ask open-ended questions in order to understand the base beliefs or values or arguments that a person is making. So if a person says we should recycle, you might ask open-ended questions. How would I benefit from recycling? In what ways does recycling affect the ecosystem? Something along those lines, and you continue to ask those questions until you feel satisfied with the whole idea, the whole argument, or until you have asked enough questions that have backed them into a corner where they feel like maybe they didn't know what they were talking about. Maybe this information wasn't as clear as they originally thought it was. And you're doing a service to people when you are Socratic with them. You don't want to approach it aggressively. You don't say, well, tell me why you think this. How could you possibly believe this? That's not Socratic. Socratic is usually a sensitive, open-ended questioning. More along the lines of, so how did you get to the point where you felt this? Or in what ways do you respond when someone asks you that? You're more of a sensitive, open-ended responding. Okay? So these are just two very, very simple ways to manage some of those listening skills. Now, if you go back and look at the issues that we tend to have, why we're not successful when we are listening, there are individual things that you can do when you are encountering these things on a regular basis. For example, if you know that the classroom that you go to is always cold, wear layers. It's simple stuff like that that's kind of common sense. But in the more in-depth or abstract or sensitive issues, the constructing of the meaning and responding with feedback and Socratic methodology, that's what is going to help. That and many other tools. So look up what you can find on deep responding or effectual listening in sensitive issues. Those are things that you could look up and find great value to. So hopefully this gave you some good feedback and some good overview information on listening. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions on the subject.